Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tammy McConnell, and I'm with the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization here at Ohio EPA, and will be moderating today's webinar. This afternoon's webinar, Hazardous Waste Requirements, the Basics, Part 2, is a continuation from this morning's webinar and is part of Ohio EPA's 2020 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. I hope you were able to join us this morning for Part 1. These webinars will occur over a 3-week period from September 21 through October 8. Please visit our conference webpage for more information about sessions you might have missed and to register for our upcoming sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate in today's event. It is a repeat from this morning, but I would like to go over it again in case we have some folks that were not able to make it this morning. On the slide, you will see a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the right-hand corner. For this webinar, you are using your computer audio. If you are having sound issues, you will need to refresh your browser. If that does not work, log off, then log back in. If that does not work, check your computer audio settings. Please feel free to submit questions by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during this presentation. We will be answering them as we go through the presentation, as well as addressing some during the Q&A session of this presentation. If we do not have time to answer your question, the presenter will reach out to you via email and assist you with your question. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation is available in the handouts section of your attendee interface. Once the webinar is edited, you will receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email, along with a session survey and a certificate of attendance. The session survey will also appear once the session is over. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to complete the survey to let us know how we are doing, or if there is anything we can do to further assist you. 1 hour of registered sanitarian and sanitarian in training continuing education units have been approved for this session. This session is also pre-approved for VAP certified PDHU credits and C and DD certified operators BMP credits. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may do so through APA's self-reporting option. Log into your My APA account and select the self-reported credits option to receive credit. If you did not enter your member number when registering for this session, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. If you are seeking other CEUs, check out our e-binder attached to today's webinar. As I mentioned, I will be the moderator for this session. We also have Tammy Heffelfinger, Supervisor of Hazardous Waste Compliance and Assurance Section in the Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization, as the subject matter expert. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our presenter, Christy Shipley, from Ohio EPA's Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization.
Hello and welcome back. In the first part of the presentation, we went over how to properly evaluate your waste, how to determine your generator category, and how hazardous waste needs to be managed while it's on site. In this session, we're going to cover how hazardous waste should be shipped, what records need to be kept, what type of emergency response procedures should be in place, as well as the level of employee training that needs to be conducted. And as promised, I'll spend a little bit of time going over the excluded solvent-contaminated wipes. And then I'll wrap up with a summary of the violations that Ohio EPA inspectors cite most frequently. So let's get started with shipping. VSQGs are not required to prepare a manifest unless that waste was generated from an episodic event, but SQGs and LQGs must prepare a manifest before shipping hazardous waste off-site. The containers also need to be packaged, labeled, and marked according to DOT, and the appropriate placards need to be offered. And if you have any specific questions regarding DOT shipping requirements, you can contact the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, because that's who oversees these regulations in our state. Under the generator improvements rules, VSQGs have an option to send their hazardous waste to an LQG for consolidation if that LQG is under the control of the same person as the VSQG. They need to follow the proper labeling requirements, but a manifest isn't required. Now, it is important to note that any waste generated from an episodic event can't be sent to an LQG. It needs to be sent with a manifest to a permitted facility. So before we get into the emergency preparedness, I just wanted to touch on what level of training facilities need to provide. And then I'll circle back to LQGs because there's more specific information for them. SQGs must ensure that all employees are thoroughly familiar with proper waste handling and emergency procedures relevant to their responsibilities during normal facility operation and emergency situation. And LQGs need to conduct classroom instruction or on-the-job training and maintain certain documentation. Now, VSQGs aren't required to conduct any personnel training, but it is recommended. SQGs and LQGs are required to maintain emergency equipment on site, and the type of emergency equipment is going to vary based on your facility, but some common ones include things such as fire extinguishers, alarm and communication systems, spill kits, personal protective equipment, and decontamination equipment. And the testing frequency it's also going to vary based on your facility, and it's most likely going to be based on the manufacturer's recommendations, maybe some OSHA recommendations, and using a little bit of common sense. For example, when it comes to spill kits, you might want to be inspecting those ones that you use more frequently on a more frequent basis, just to ensure that you have enough supplies. As part of emergency preparedness, it's necessary to maintain adequate aisle space. So having aisle space to be able to get in and read labels is great, but it's required so that personnel and equipment can get in there to respond to a release or a fire. SQGs and LQGs are also required to make arrangements with local emergency authorities, and under the new rules, you need to keep documentation that the arrangements have been made. And the purpose of the arrangement is to just familiarize local responders with your facility so that they know the layout, the properties of the hazardous waste that you have on site, where people are likely to be working, and the possible evacuation routes. All of the important details that someone would want to know if they were responding to an emergency at your facility. If you're an SQG, you need to have at least one employee on the premises or on call who can respond to emergencies at your facility. And while SQGs aren't required to have a written plan in place, the rule does require certain procedures to be followed. For example, if there's a spill, it needs to be contained and cleaned up as soon as practical. If there's a fire, you need to call the fire department or attempt to extinguish it using a fire extinguisher if you've been properly trained to do so. And if you have a fire, explosion, or other release that could threaten people outside of your facility, or if the spill could reach surface water, you need to immediately notify the National Response Center. Now, if you're an LQG, you must prepare and maintain a written contingency plan. And the plan must be designed to minimize hazards to human health or the environment from fires, explosions, or any unplanned sudden or non-sudden release of hazardous waste. And then the plan needs to be implemented immediately in any of those situations. In addition, an LQG must maintain all reports of contingency plan implementation on file and report these incidents to the Director of the Ohio EPA. A copy of your contingency plan and revisions must be maintained at your facility and submitted to all local police, fire departments, hospitals, and emergency response teams. So on this slide, I've provided a link to the generator handbook, and in Appendix 3, there is a sample contingency plan that you can reference. The new rules require the development of a quick reference guide for contingency plans to provide easy access to emergency responders to the most critical information when they're responding to an emergency. Facilities that become LQGs after the rule goes into effect need to submit this quick reference guide when they submit their plan, but existing LQGs only need to submit it when they're submitting a revised plan due to other necessary revisions. The quick reference guide consists of 8 elements. It needs to list the types of hazardous waste and their associated hazards. It needs to have the estimated max amount of each hazardous waste on site and specify if there are any hazardous waste that require unique or special treatment. For example, things that may react violently with water because that's something the fire department would want to know, or if you have something like hydrofluoric acid, that will dictate what type of PPE someone would wear and how medical professionals would treat someone that has been exposed to it. That's something the hospital would want to know. The quick reference guide needs to also include a map of the facility and show where hazardous waste is located. There also needs to be a street map that shows the facility in relation to the surrounding businesses, residences, and schools, and the location of the water supply. Any information about the on-site notification systems to communicate with the facility personnel needs to be included. And lastly, the name and number of the person designated as the emergency coordinator. Manifests are multiple copied tracking documents that accompany hazardous waste shipments. The manifest acts as a chain of custody for the waste from the point it leaves your business until it reaches its final destination. Each person who generates, transports, stores, treats, or disposes of waste must sign and retain a copy of that manifest for their records. And this provides a traceable link between your business and the designated facility. Once the hazardous waste reaches its final destination, the person receiving your waste returns a signed copy of that manifest back to you. And be sure to provide enough copies of your manifest so that each transporter has a copy for their records. And the designated facility needs to have 2 copies, one for their records and one that will be returned to you. In 2018, the US EPA launched the eManifest system, which is a national electronic system to track hazardous waste shipments. And many of you may already be using eManifest instead of paper copies at this point. If you aren't and you're looking for more information on eManifest, I've provided a link here that will take you to Ohio EPA's website, where we have a lot more information on eManifest, including a very helpful video and instructions on how to sign up for this service. An exception report is another element of the manifest tracking system. And this report lets Ohio EPA know that you didn't receive a signed copy of your manifest back in the appropriate time frame. When you ship your hazardous waste to the treatment, storage, and disposal facility, they're required to send a signed copy back to you. If you're an SQG and you don't receive a signed copy of that manifest back from the designated facility within 60 days of the date that your waste was accepted by that first transporter, you need to send a manifest exception report to the Ohio EPA. If you're an LQG and you don't receive a copy of the signed manifest within 35 days from the date your waste was accepted by the first transporter, you need to contact the transporter and/or the designated facility to find out the status of your waste. And then if you still don't receive a signed copy back within 45 days, you need to submit an exception report. Exception reports need to include a readable copy of the manifest for which you don't have a confirmation of delivery. And if you're an LQG, you also need to send a cover letter signed by a facility representative explaining the efforts taken to locate your waste and the results of those efforts. Now, if you're an SQG, you're not required to send a signed cover letter, but you need to provide some indication that you haven't received confirmation of delivery from the designated facility. So in some circumstances, your hazardous waste might be rejected from the TSDF. Maybe they've reached the capacity of the waste that they're able to have on site because that's something that is specified in their permit. Or maybe they're not able to treat the hazardous waste that was sent to them. When you receive a rejected load back, you can store it for 90 or 180 days, depending on the amount of hazardous waste that's on site during the calendar month that it's received. All right, so we have reached a poll question. Who must file a biennial hazardous waste report? One, everyone who shipped hazardous waste off-site. Two, only LQGs. Three, only permitted treatment, storage, or disposal facilities.
Okay, the polls have been opened. If you do not see it yet, you should be seeing it here in a few seconds. Please make your selections. Okay, we have people responding, so we will be closing them momentarily. If you haven't made your selection yet, please do so.
All right, so I think the poll has been closed, and 24% of you said that everyone that shipped hazardous waste off-site needs to do a biennial report. 66% of you said only LQGs, and 10% said permitted treatment, storage, and or disposal facilities. Well, the answer is only LQGs. So if you're required to file a biennial report if your business reached LQG status at any time in the previous calendar year. Biennial reports need to be received by Ohio EPA's Division of Environmental Response and Revitalization by March 1st of every even-numbered year. Information included in this report is based on the previous calendar year's waste generation, and you should only report the hazardous waste that counted toward the determination of your generator status. This includes waste that are generated, accumulated, and subsequently managed on-site or shipped off-site. US EPA intended the land disposal restrictions, or LDR standards, to ensure that toxic constituents present in hazardous waste are properly treated before they're land disposed. Hazardous waste, or some component of it, is often placed into a permitted hazardous waste landfill. The disposal of hazardous waste in a landfill has the potential over a long period of time to threaten human health and the environment by leaking hazardous constituents into the groundwater, even though the landfill has a liner or other safeguards. And as a result, most hazardous waste must be treated to meet specific treatment standards prior to disposal in a permitted hazardous waste landfill. So as I mentioned previously, SQGs and LQGs need to have training programs to ensure that the personnel who manage hazardous waste are familiar with their responsibilities. LQGs have more in-depth training requirements. Personnel involved with hazardous waste management should have training in proper waste handling and emergency procedures appropriate to the types of waste handled. And generally, employees need to be familiar with the types of emergency equipment on site, the communication systems, and how to implement the contingency plan. Personnel training documentation needs to be maintained on file at the facility, including written job titles and descriptions for each position related to hazardous waste management activities. Facility personnel need to complete an initial training program within 6 months of being hired, and then an annual refresher thereafter. There needs to be a written description of the type and the amount of training that will be given to each job position. And there needs to be some record kept to document that either the classroom training or the necessary on-the-job experience has been completed. Personnel training records on current employees need to be kept until closure of the facility, and personnel training records for former employees needs to be kept for at least 3 years from the date the employee last worked at the facility. LQGs need to train employees on proper implementation of the contingency plan, specifically on the actions that need to be taken when responding to fires, explosions, or releases of hazardous waste. They need to know how to coordinate with local emergency responders and have access to a list of names, home addresses, and telephone numbers of all emergency coordinators. And please note, as part of the generator improvements rules, there won't be a requirement for the home addresses anymore. It's just the names and phone numbers. Employees also need to be trained on emergency equipment, which includes their location, the description, and an explanation of the capabilities. And finally, employees need to know how to execute an evacuation properly. Existing closure requirements for LQGs accumulating hazardous waste in tanks, drip pads, and containment buildings require closure of the facility as a landfill should it fail to clean close. And LQGs accumulating hazardous waste in containers do not have this requirement. And there's been numerous documented cases where LQGs accumulating in containers have abandoned their facilities only to require Superfund removal action, sometimes costing millions of dollars in cleanup. Under the generator improvements rules, when an LQG closes either an accumulation unit or the entire facility, a notification is required. When closing an accumulation unit, which includes the central accumulation area, they need to either place a notice in the operating record within 30 days of closing it, or they can notify the Ohio EPA within 90 days that the closure performance standards have been met. If the entire facility is closing, you'll need to notify the Ohio EPA 30 days prior, and then again 90 days after closing to confirm that the closure performance standards have been met. If more than 90 days is needed to meet the closure performance standards, an extension can be requested, but keep in mind that you would need to request it no later than 75 days after closing the facility. You can't wait until the last possible moment to ask for an extension here. And just to clarify, closure is not needed for satellite accumulation areas. Now we're moving into the record keeping requirements. All generators need to keep records of test results, analysis, and other documents that are related to their hazardous waste determinations. And these records need to be retained at least 3 years after the waste was last shipped off-site. And while VSQGs don't have many requirements, they are still required to demonstrate proper waste evaluation and disposal. The record-keeping retention requirements for SQGs and LQGs is 3 years and includes the following information: all manifests, land disposal restrictions, biennial reports, weekly container inspections, inspections of emergency equipment, daily tank inspections, and please note this does include weekends. And in addition, LQGs need to maintain their employee training records, contingency plan, and closure notifications. As I mentioned in the session this morning, solvent-contaminated wipes are specifically excluded from hazardous waste regulation, but only if certain conditions are met. There are conditional exclusions for wipes that are sent off for cleaning. These are referred to as reusable wipes, and a conditional exemption also for wipes that are sent for disposal. And one way to understand how the exclusion works is to look at what makes it ineligible. So wipes that contain listed hazardous waste other than solvents, or if they exhibit the characteristic of toxicity, corrosivity, or reactivity due to contaminants other than solvents, they are not eligible. There's a very handy chart created by US EPA that summarizes the regulation for the reusable and the disposable wipes. And the first part of the table spells out exactly what's included. The exclusion is for wipes that contain one or more of the F001 through F005 listed solvents or the corresponding solvents on the P or U list. So remember, those lists are for the unused chemicals. The exclusion is also for wipes that exhibit a characteristic resulting from a listed solvent, or if they exhibit only the hazardous characteristic of ignitability when containing one or more of non-listed solvents. And the second part of the table spells out what's not included. So wipes cannot be contaminated with listed hazardous waste other than solvents, and they can't be toxic, corrosive, or reactive from the presence of non-listed solvents. And something to note here, because I think a lot of facilities might be using wipes and a degreaser that contain trichloroethylene, disposal wipes that are hazardous waste due to the presence of trichloroethylene or TCE are not eligible for the exclusion. And this is because EPA's final risk analysis demonstrates that wipes contaminated with TCE may pose a significant risk to human health and the environment when disposed in a lined landfill. The rule contains conditions that must be followed. So if one of those conditions is violated, then the wipes would need to be managed as hazardous waste instead. The conditions for both the reusable and the disposable wipes are very similar. Here's a list of all the conditions. The containers need to be closed and non-leaking and capable of holding free liquids. They need to be labeled as excluded solvent-contaminated wipes, and there is a 180-day accumulation limit from the time the first wipe was put into the container. There can't be any free liquids present by the time it's sent off for disposal or laundering. The liquids need to be managed as hazardous waste if there are any free liquids. And there needs to be certain documentation for the management, which includes the name and address of the landfill or laundry facility, as well as documentation of how that 180-day limit is met, and a description of the process used to ensure that no free liquids are present. And the final requirement is that the wipes have to be disposed at a municipal waste or industrial waste landfill, or if they're being laundered, the laundry facility has to have their discharge regulated under the Clean Water Act. All right, next poll question. Can solvent-contaminated wipes be sent to a municipal solid waste landfill if all the conditions for the exclusion are met? 1, yes, 2, no.
Okay, the polls have been launched, so as soon as you see that pop up on your computer, please make your selection. Looks like we've already had everyone make their selection.
And everyone was right, 100%. Said yes, they can go to a municipal waste landfill as long as the conditions are met. So if you still have some questions about how to manage solvent-contaminated wipes, I've linked a guidance document that has some more information on wipes, as well as the management of other textiles that are laundered for use, and that would include things such as gloves or uniforms. Now I'm going to highlight the violations that Ohio EPA inspectors cite the most. These are the top violations based on data collected from December 2002 through November 2004. And these are still accurate with what we see today. Throughout all the years, the #1 violation has been waste evaluation, over twice as much as any other violation. Other common violations include improper labeling and management of containers, not maintaining inspection logs, not testing or maintaining emergency equipment, and mistakes in biannual reports. And since it's the most common violation, I really want to drive home the fact that it's very important not to overlook waste streams and put them into the general trash before you've confirmed that they're not hazardous. So this is something that should be communicated to all employees who could possibly be disposing of things. To avoid container management violations, the simplest thing that you can do as a business is just to communicate to employees how hazardous waste containers should be managed so that everyone's aware to keep the containers closed and handle them in a manner to prevent damage or possible leaks. Because it only takes one person to make a mistake and leave a container open, and that could result in a cited violation. It's also a good idea to have a backup person or maybe multiple backup people to conduct the weekly inspections. Someone may be out sick or scheduled off on vacation on the day that the inspection is normally scheduled. So just having that system in place could prevent a gap in the inspection records. To avoid emergency equipment violations, you want to make sure that you are inspecting your alarm systems, fire protection equipment, spill kits, and decontamination equipment at the appropriate interval, and also document those inspections. If you're an LQG in an odd numbered year, you'll have to submit a biennial report by March 1st of the even numbered year. And this is probably easier for facilities to keep track of if they're always an LQG. So it's important to track your generation rates so that you know if you're an LQG and you know when you need to file a report. Make sure that your report's accurate. Keep in mind it should only include your hazardous waste streams. So no universal waste or used oil, and you should always double check it for accuracy before submitting. So I'll go ahead and probably say it for the 100th time. If you take anything away from this presentation, I hope it's the knowledge to properly evaluate your waste streams, or at least know what direction you need to go in to start that process. It's also very important to track hazardous waste generation rates so that you know what requirements that you need to follow. And here at the Ohio EPA, we're always happy to answer any questions you have. So feel free to reach out to someone either in the hazardous waste program or at the Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention with any of your hazardous waste questions. In these next few slides, I just put some links in that I felt might be helpful so that you can easily access the hazardous waste rules and guidance documents. I know sometimes it's not always easy to navigate your way through the main EPA site, so you can reference these here. We also maintain a directory for recyclers, so if you have a material, maybe scrap metal or antifreeze, that you're looking for a recycling outlet, you can search here to see what businesses are nearby. And just another slide with some important hazardous waste links. And this is the RCRA online tool. It's a great place to search by topic, so you can see if the US EPA has published an interpretive memo on something. And finally, we also have a section of our website called the Answer Place. This is where you can search to see if the Ohio EPA has already answered a question you might have. And if you still have questions, you can reach out to the Hazardous Waste Program or someone at the Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention if you wish to remain anonymous. Right, so I think we're going to pause to see if we have any questions that are still left unanswered.
Before we get to the questions and answers, I do apologize for the last poll question. I saw 100% said yes, and I failed to look at how many people actually voted. And there were only 2, but those 2 people got it right. But sorry about that.
Okay, so the poll must have closed early, but good job.
Okay, so thank you, Christy. We're going to begin the Q&A session of the presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If you do not hear your question, the presenter will reach out to you after the conference. You can email the presenter if you would like to ask a more detailed question after the session. Okay, Christy, I have first question. Under the current rules, as a CESQG, do we have to notify for when becoming a SQG for 1 month?
Okay, so if you already have an EPA ID number, you wouldn't need to notify us just for bumping up for that 1 month. But if you don't have an ID number, then you would need to notify.
Okay, great. Thank you, Christy. Second question. If my business has changed names or locations, do I need to submit a form and get a new ID number? Or can I request the ID number to be changed to my site?
Okay, so if you change locations, you will need a new ID number, and that's because the ID numbers are tied to the physical address. So if you move, we ask that you submit a letter to deactivate that old number. If there are any future occupants at that site, that number would be reassigned to them if they're generating hazardous waste.
Great, thank you. If an episodic generation happens in an odd year, do you need to file a biannual report?
Okay, so if you had an episodic event that made you an LQG in an odd numbered year, as long as if you've already complied with the requirements for episodic generation, so notification for your planned and unplanned event, then no, you would not need to file a biannual report.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me see. When does Ohio expect to adopt the federal rules?
Okay, so they'll be effective October 5th, and they are already posted on our website.
Okay, great, thank you. Does that requirement to empty tanks upon closure mean when the facility shuts down completely or every time the facility isn't open?
Okay, so I think that question was from this morning's session, and closure refers to closure of the entire facility.
Great, thank you. What method do SQGs use to submit the notification report by next September? And do we notify both Ohio EPA and US EPA?
Okay, so when SQGs need to re-notify, you're just going to be resubmitting your site ID form, that form 9029, and that can be done electronically or paper copy, and you're just going to submit it to Ohio EPA, not US EPA.
Great, thank you, Christy. Let me see. Okay, here's another one. For episodic generation and ship the waste within 60 days, is that 60 days from the beginning of the episode or 60 days from the date the container is full during the episode? In other words, if a container is filled on day 59 of an episode, must it be shipped the next day?
Okay, so that 60 days starts when the activities associated with your event start.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. Will the generator be held responsible for elements of the new hazardous waste HWGIR? I'm thinking generator
Improvement rules, yeah.
Yeah, before Ohio EPA has adopted the new rules.
Okay, so they become effective on October 5th, so that's the date you want to keep in mind for compliance.
Okay. If a contractor comes to a company's site and their activities generate hazardous waste, who is the generator, the site or the contractor, using the site address?
Okay, so that would be considered cogeneration, and someone would need to take responsibility for that, either the facility or the contractor.
If a facility has changed generator categories and is no longer a large quantity generator, would it still need to submit a closure notification?
Okay, so if just the generator category has changed, If that central accumulation area is still being used, no notifications required. But when it is closed or moved or the entire facility closes, that's when you would need to follow the closure notification requirements if you're an LQG after October 5th, 2020.
Great, thank you. Let's see, another question. If we manage paint-related waste as universal, do we need to include it on the biannual report?
No, so universal waste paint would not count towards your generator category, and it would not be included on the biennial report.
Great, thank you. Does each satellite accumulation area need to be listed in the contingency report?
Okay, so the contingency plan, the new quick reference guide requires all of there to be a map showing the locations of the hazardous waste storage. So yes, the satellite areas would need to be included on that.
Thank you, Christy. Can I use a plastic trash bag to collect solvent-contaminated wipes?
So yes, you can use a plastic bag as long as it meets the closed container standards, and it needs to be able to contain free liquids.
Great, thank you. Does the solvent-contaminated wipes exemption apply to wipes that have paint and solvent on them?
So no, I know some paints may contain solvent, but they would not meet the exemption.
Thank you. Another question. If a facility has changed generator categories and is no longer a large quantity generator, would it still need to submit a closure notification?
Wait, I think did we answer this one?
Oh, you may have.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it was about.
Yep, a little bit above, sorry.
That's all right.
If we manage paint-related waste, we already had that one too. How about, does each satellite accumulation area need to be, it looks like we have all of them.
Okay.
All of those. Let me see if there are any other ones. Just a moment.
And if anyone thinks of any other questions, my email address is on this slide, so you can reach out to me at any time.
Okay, here's one. Does Ohio EPA have any guidance documents describing appropriate management of aerosol can pumps?
I'll have to look into that one and get back to you. I don't know right off the top of my head.
Yep. Okay, we have some more questions coming in. Let's see. When does a release of RCRA hazardous waste need to be reported?
Tammy, if you have the contact information for the people asking those questions, I can certainly reach out to them after.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Hazardous Waste Requirements, the Basics Part 2. If you have any additional questions, please contact Christy directly or call our office. As I mentioned earlier, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would appreciate if you would complete that to provide us your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, a certificate of attendance, and another link to the survey in case you do not have a chance to complete it now. Can you advance to the next slide, Christy? Thank you. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you are able to participate in more of Ohio EPA's Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. What's coming up next is the hazardous waste rules. What's coming down the line, that'll be Tuesday, September 29th at 10. And a deeper dive into the universal waste and used oil rules at 2 o'clock that same day. Please don't forget to register for any more sessions that you would like to have. Thank you and have a good day.